Welcome everyone to the fifth week of this teaching initiative co-hosted by the London Business School Wheeler Institute for Business and Development on African history through the lens of economics. Let me give an overview of what we have covered in the past 4 weeks and what we should expect in the weeks to come. So we started 4 weeks ago with Chris Eret and in the introductory remarks going over the long-run economic history of the continent. Then we zoomed into the pre-colonial period and on the period that has been coined as Africa's slave trades, and progressively we move to today's lecture, which will focus on a period that has been coined as the Scramble for Africa. We are extremely honored and privileged to have with us Jeff Herbst and Tanaka Chiba. Let me start with Tanaka, who will collect questions as they have been, as you will pose them on the Zoom Q&A, and will pose them to Stelios and Jeff in the end. So Tanaka works at McKinsey & Company. She is a managing director and a member of the executive team of this global consulting firm. Tanaka graduated from South Africa. She was a chartered accountant in her home country, South Africa, and then she completed her Sloan Fellowship at the London Business School, where I had the privilege and pleasure to meet her. Tanaka not only is a top executive at one of the world's most renowned consulting firms, but she has also set up her own consulting firm. So she's both a consultant and an entrepreneur. And she has had a prolific career actually navigating herself between South Africa, Europe, and the United Kingdom. Tanaka, thanks big time for being with us and hosting the Q&A, which I look forward to. Now, our other guest is Jeff Herbst. Let me say here that it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Jeff. I recently met, but we read with Stelios his extremely influential and very succinct and important book on African economic history, States and Power in Africa, when we started our journey in the continent with Stelios something like 15 years ago. Jeff is currently the president of the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, and before that, actually, Jeff was also the president of Colgate University. He has had a prolific career as a top administrator in leading universities. During his academic years, Jeff done very important work coming from political science, but actually very close to the intersection of policy science with economics on states, on the Scramble for Africa, which is the topic of our discussion. He had some specialty in Zimbabwe and Southern African politics and economics. And Jeff, let me say that it's a real honor for us and for all of our attendees that you are joining us. And Stelios, my dear friend and co-author, will present our joint work on the so-called long-run effects of the Scramble for Africa. So today's session will focus on issues that sadly are quite relevant outside the continent. So issues that we will touch upon today, like state artificiality stemming from colonization, artificial borders, artificial states, are issues but by no means are confined to the African continent. And I just want to express on behalf of Stelios, Leonard, and Nathan, our very strong sympathies and our concern about the people of Ukraine and people in Eastern Europe who suffer as this lecture takes place. So Jeff, Tanaka, and Stelios, thanks a lot for being with us. I think we start with Jeff and your introductory remarks. To all of you, as in the previous weeks, please start sending us questions. We will try to answer some of them live, and Tanaka will be collecting questions to pose to Stelios and Jeff in the end. Thanks again.
Thank you so very much. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to be addressing such a large audience, especially an audience from Africa, and also delighted as a political scientist to be part of this discussion. While the disciplines have their own boundaries, I think it's important to cross them. I want to talk about the Scramble for Africa, the creation of African boundaries, the maintenance of African boundaries. I'll give you my bottom line first, which is all boundaries are artificial. There's almost nothing like a natural boundary. There are very few geographic features. There are almost no demographic features that obviously separate peoples. Boundaries are always created by people. And the signal that boundaries are almost always artificial is that almost all states believe that their natural boundaries are bigger than where their boundaries should be today, suggesting that there's no consensus on what boundaries should be. Boundaries in all cases are created, and that means also that states are always artificial creations. It drives me a little crazy when I hear that African states are artificial. That's true, because they were created by people, but so were France and Switzerland, which are in many ways no more natural and as artificial as African states, they were created over hundreds of years, grouping together disparate populations that quite oftentimes did not want to be with each other. But we sometimes have a different view of what's artificial means in Africa versus Europe and the rest of the world. Boundaries, states are always created. They're created by political decisions, sometimes taken by Africans in the case of Africa, sometimes by others. To begin the discussion today, I thought I would show a video clip of a very interesting and important statement that Martin Kimani, the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations, made the other day about the conflict in Ukraine. And while it's formally about Ukraine, it's really about African decisions about African boundaries, and well worth hearing as a lead off to our discussion. Let me play that now.
Gravely concerned by the announcement made by the Russian Federation to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine as independent states. In our considered view, this action and announcement breaches the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We do not deny that there may be serious security concerns in these regions, but they cannot justify today's recognition of these regions as independent states, not when there are multiple diplomatic tracks available and underway that have the ability to offer peaceful solutions. Mr. President, this situation echoes our history. Kenya and almost every African country was birthed by the ending of empire. Our borders were not of our own drawing. They were drawn in the distant colonial metropoles of London, Paris, and Lisbon, with no regard for the ancient nations that they cleaved apart. Today, across the border of every single African country live our countrymen, with whom we share deep historical, cultural, and linguistic bonds. At independence, had we chosen to pursue states on the basis of ethnic, racial, or religious homogeneity, we would still be waging bloody wars these many decades later. Instead, we agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental political, economic, and legal integration. Rather than form nations that looked ever backwards into history with a dangerous nostalgia, we chose to look forward to a greatness none of our many nations and peoples had ever known. We chose to follow the rules of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Charter, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace. We rejected irredentism and expansionism on any basis, including racial, ethnic, religious, or cultural factors. We reject it again today. Kenya registers its strong concern and opposition to the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. We further strongly condemn the trend in the last few decades of powerful states, including members of this Security Council, breaching international law with little regard. Multilateralism lies on its deathbed tonight. It has been assaulted today as it has been by other powerful states in the recent past. We call on all members to rally behind the Secretary General in asking him to rally us all to the standard that defends multilateralism. We also
So let me stop the clip there, but there's a lot to unpack in that very important statement. I'd like to begin by talking about the situation in Africa, and obviously this is a gross generalization because situations varied from place to place in the continent across a large amount of distance. But talk about state dynamics briefly before colonialism, before formal colonialism, which I'll tie to 1885 in the Congress of Berlin. And what's notable about Africa and the rise and fall of states over the centuries before formal colonialism is several things. First, there were a wide diversity of states, ranging from empires to nation states to highly decentralized villages, different types of polities. Second, they were dynamic. They rose and they fell. They moved across space. When they were successful, they expanded. When they were unsuccessful, they contracted. When they were too unsuccessful, they fell apart to be replaced by something else. Third, the boundaries were extremely flexible. Boundaries moved all the time. And the understanding of boundaries was not of fixed spatial demarcations like today, but of zones of boundaries. Therefore, sovereignty was a very complex phenomenon. And people could have, rulers could have complex sovereignty where people might have obligations to one or more rulers. This is in the context of a continent where there was a significant amount of land surplus, relatively low population densities, and where states could expand and decline. There was nothing particularly unique about the African situation before colonialism. It rivaled in many ways medieval Europe and many other parts of the world, where states were also of a diversity of form. They were dynamic. The boundaries were not spatially fixed, but flexible, and sovereignty was a complex understanding. Europe had a long involvement in Africa, but the decisions to formally colonize Africa in the latter part of the 19th century were relatively late. Indeed, the colonization and decolonization of South America had already occurred before the colonization of Africa, formally beginning in the later 19th century, even though Africa is much closer to the European continent. The Europeans were skeptical that there was money to be made in Africa. They faced significant health problems in trying to move, especially into the interior. And they were at times before the middle part of the 19th century, not militarily superior to African forces on the ground. However, because of a variety of technological developments, including the machine gun and anti-malarial drugs, and European rivalry, as well as decisions taken by Europeans on the ground, the scramble for Africa began in earnest in the latter part of the 19th century. Europeans faced a challenge. They wanted to demarcate the vast area of Africa, but they didn't particularly want to fight inter-European wars over it. So in a process that was complex, but took a relatively short period of time, they divided up a set of rules whereby European powers would demarcate Africa for the convenience of the Europeans. What this meant was that by the early part of the 20th century, 1903, almost all of Africa had been partitioned by the Europeans and had been done so while with great amounts of violence against Africans, relatively little inter-European conflict. For the Europeans, the partition of Africa was a success. For the Africans, of course, it was a disaster. And the Europeans managed not only to apply boundaries to African countries, but they changed the African dynamic in several other ways. One of which was they imposed one form of political organization, empire, on what had been a vast territory with many different forms of state. And by 1924, when Southern Rhodesia, which had been privately owned by a company, the British South African Company, became a colony of England, Africa had only one type of political organization, colony. The boundaries were also fixed and they were not dynamic. What's striking is that I'm going to share a screen again. You'll see a familiar map. What's striking is that Africa had not only been demarcated by 1900, but that I'm just going to, there we go. Africa had not only been demarcated by 1900, but by 2000, the boundaries really hadn't changed that much. Now, what happened that the Scramble for Africa was not only successful from a European perspective in demarcating the continent relatively quickly, but that those boundaries stuck, as it were, through the independence period. The boundaries that the Europeans created were for the convenience of the Europeans. About 42% of African land boundaries are straight lines, indicating that they were drawn far from local circumstances, again, for the convenience of Europeans. These boundaries stuck through the 20th century, and the Europeans had no desire to change them during the colonial period, with the exception of the dissolution of the German colonial holdings after World War I. So the Africans were faced with a problem in the late 1950s and early 1960s, as Ambassador Kamani said. They confronted a map which all Africans agreed did not make sense. The lines were straight, some countries were very small, some countries were very large. There was a perception that people were grouped together who didn't necessarily belong together, and the boundaries split apart people who had natural affiliations. The Europeans, of course, had no notion when they were drawing these lines that they were creating the boundaries of independent states. The boundaries were really done for convenience, and it would have been astonishing to the Europeans to be told that they were creating the eventual map of Africa when they drew these lines. Nonetheless, the Africans were faced with a series of choices in the late 1950s and early 1960s about what to do about this map. And the debate really came down to arguments between two leaders, President Nyerere, Prime Minister Nyerere of Tanzania, and Prime Minister Nkrumah of Ghana. Nyerere argued that African countries should delay their independence so that they could become independent together. And that would allow them to change boundaries, create larger regional and perhaps a continental bloc, and therefore right the colonial wrongs of the map. And he argued that if countries became independent one by one, interests would soon solidify around national boundaries and it would be impossible to change the map. And Nkrumah, on the other hand, argued, seek ye first the political kingdom. That is, get independence as quickly as possible. It was an important objective. He was perhaps worried that the United Kingdom would change its mind. He wanted to seize the moment. And in fact, the African countries became independent one by one and did not change the map. Now, why did the African countries decide, as Ambassador Kamani said, to adopt this map, even though in many ways it didn't make sense, and essentially ratify the Scramble for Africa that the Europeans had created in the latter part of the 19th century? There are a few different reasons. One, as I said before, there are no natural boundaries. You might say that this map is artificial, but there's no natural way to divide up Africa by geography, and there's no natural way to divide up Africa by people. As you know, Africans, like everyone else, have multiple identities, and identities change over time, so that it's impossible to draw a map that just creates countries that are uniformly identical in terms of identity, because identity is constantly changing. So there was no obvious map for the Africans to revert to. Second, the African leaders had seen what had happened in the Indian subcontinent in the late 1940s, when a line was drawn to demarcate India from Pakistan and 1 million people died. And we're aware that if boundaries were changed, it would create mass movements of people and therefore tremendous human suffering. Third, the international climate of the day was that the superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, and the great powers, the European colonial powers, all were strongly in favor of a boundary stability across the world, in large part because they did not want to destabilize the very delicate situation in Germany. The superpowers during the Cold War certainly intervened in the domestic affairs of individual countries. However, by and large, they did not promote boundary change. When African countries were faced with secessionist movements like the Katanga movement in Congo, the great powers came to the aid of the national government to maintain stability. When Somalia threatened its neighbors with irredentist claims, again, the Soviet Union came to the aid of Ethiopia. When Biafra tried to secede from Nigeria in the late 1960s, the world more or less came to the aid of Lagos in trying to maintain the national integrity of Nigeria. So the international climate was one where boundaries across the world, no matter how artificial they were, and they were certainly plenty artificial in Germany, were protected. And finally, as Boutros Boutros-Ghali, when he was an academic, noted, the one thing that African leaders had in common when they came together to form the Organization for African Unity in the early 1960s was that they were leaders of existing African states. And they did not know if the boundaries would begin to change, if they would have states to lead once the dust settled. And therefore, they had a profound personal elite interest, as Nyeri predicted they would, in maintaining the states as they existed. Now, the remarkable thing about this map, as I said, compared to Europe or compared to almost any other time in human history, is that it's remained stable. So what's interesting, and I'll conclude here, about the scramble for Africa and the subsequent 120 years is that a series of very explicit decisions were taken. First by the colonialists about how to demarcate a vast territory without military competition among themselves. And then by the Africans about what to do about this map. It's very seldom in human history do you have such explicit political decisions. Usually leaders just slide into something over a period of time. But this map was embraced, as Ambassador Kimani said, by African leaders in order to avoid interstate war. It was at a cost. The cost was that states which are dysfunctional, which don't work for one of many reasons, just cannot be replaced by some other political form.